Alright, so this is our video that is going to start the active heat process. This is going to take longer. There's obviously some more activity, that's why it's active heat. Right now my passive heat ink and dye is actually outside and it's doing its work. Here we're going to be doing the active heat recipe, which requires the heat source. We're just going to get started in this video, and then we'll start a new video once the process gets going a little bit further. So I have my induction heat cooktop. That's going to be my heat source. I have my pot, which you saw in the materials video with the lid, and all of my dye stuff is in here. So there were 6 avocados, so there's the skins from 6 and then 6 pits as well. And what I want to do, oh, and let me also mention, I've already started soaking my water. So the water is in a little container. It is warm water, and that way that it'll penetrate the fabric a little faster, and I'm just going to let it sit in there for a while. And you can have your fabric soaking for hours if you want, or as little as 20 minutes. I'm just going to leave it in there until we need it. One of the big questions that people always have is, how much water do you need? And so the main thing that you want to do for beginning fabric dyeing with natural dye stuffs is making sure that you use enough water to really cover your dye stuffs in the pot. And I'm not sure if the video will be able to capture this, but already there's a little bit of color in the water just from the avocados being in there and this water being added. The other thing to keep in mind is if you want to use a lot of fabric, then you want to add a little bit more water. You want the fabric to be able to move around in there freely. We're just using small pieces. You might be able to even fit a t-shirt in your pot, but you want to add more water. But that would probably be the maximum of the amount of fabric you can dye from these videos. So right now I have enough water in here to really move around all the dye stuff. I might add a little more so it's covered a little more. Then I put the pot with the lid, the lid on the pot, and I'm going to start the heat. And really important for avocado, the hotter it gets, the more brown the color. So I want to make sure that I do bring this to a boil. So depending on whatever heat source you're using, this could take a little time or a bit more time. But once it hits a boil, I want to make sure that I turn down the water. And so that way it's just simmering. So maybe little bits of bubbles on the top, not a whole lot of bubbles. And then that amount of heat, that simmering, lasts for about an hour. And then you just take off all the heat. So bring it to a boil and then simmer it. So that way you would just have a little bit of bubble. You still have some heat source. You bring down the temperature and then you take it off the heat altogether. And we don't want to touch it again until it's about room temperature, or at least cool enough to touch. So this could be, up to 3 hours, depending on how much time it takes for your stove to work to bring things to a boil. So the very first section here is just getting the dye stuff and water in the pot, pre-soaking your fabric and having that ready for whenever it is, starting the heat, bringing it to a boil, lowering the heat to a simmer, and then taking it off the heat altogether until it's a nice room temperature, or at least touchable with your hands. And that's it for this first video. Get it to that point and then join me for the next video for the next section of the active heat recipe. Okay, this quick little video is just going to show you what's happening in my dye pot right now. So it's been about 20 minutes since I started everything up, and I am at a nice little boil. And so I wanted to show you, you can turn down the heat so it's simmering. So this little bit of bubbling is a little too much actually. So I'm going to turn down the heat. And we just want it occasional bubbles right now for about an hour. We really want to make slow heat. So even though this is an active heat recipe, the slower the natural dye stuffs, in this case the avocado, heat up, the less likely they're going to actually cook. So any of this stuff could cook, and then that often darkens the color. Not like dark colors are bad or anything, but you have a little more control if you just kind of slowly heat everything up. So I have with this. I turned down the heat a little bit, and I'm just gonna test the color. And I have this paintbrush. It has really thick bristles, so I often use it just to dip in. And it already has a little bit of color. It's going to be a little hard, I think, to see in the video because it glistens. However, even after about 20-25 minutes, we already have started to see some color happen. If you, over time, this will darken actually because it needs to hit the oxygen. If you can see in the dye pot, then you can see that there's actually quite a bit of color in here, but it will darken the more heat and the longer that everything sits. And so it'll be a little bit harder to see the avocado pits because it'll darken so much that things will be harder to see in there. I'm going to let this simmer with some heat for an hour, and then I'm going to take it off the heat completely and let it cool down to the point where I can actually touch the water, because that will be the next stage of what it is that we're going to do with everything. So turn off this video, and then the next video will show all of the final steps on the active heat recipe.